is not a one-way conversation. This is something that we would very much like you to participate in. So if you have a comment or a question as we go through this conversation, I really recommend that you just raise your hand and we can get you up onto the stage. Hi Sylvie and Nora, welcome to the conversation. It's an important one. Okay, so I think what's going to be maybe a good idea for us to do is just to give you a little bit of background before we kick off with our conversation. So Joseph Gelfer and myself have decided to, in 2023, have this conversation about the nexus between the climate crisis and business, and we've called it the Climate Business Nexus Show for that reason. And our objective over the months to come is to have a chat to thought leaders, like, for example, Shawna, about various topics related to the intersection that we are now experiencing with the climate crisis, what we need to do about it, and what that means for our businesses and how to re-engineer those. So just by way of introduction, perhaps, Joseph, you can just tell everybody a little bit more about your background and where you are joining us from today as co-host.
Sure. So I'm Joseph Gelfer and the founder of Ecotropian Careers, which helps people transition to green jobs. I already know a couple of friendly faces down below today. So 2 streams of what I'm doing, helping people transition into green jobs and also providing climate literacy training for business so that people don't have to get a new job necessarily, but to make their current job green. And I guess just as well, riffing off what Peter was saying about the social nature of this, is that it's not just about kind of what we're saying, but also I'd encourage you down there to connect with one another. One of the things I like so much about LinkedIn audio is that you can connect with one another in a way that's a little bit more intuitive and easier than places like Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse. So always take the chance to create serendipity. I love serendipity and the happy accidents that happen. So I encourage you all, if you're not already familiar with us, to connect with us and also to connect with one another.
Thanks, Joseph. So just for everybody to know, I'm in South Africa at the moment, at the southern tip of South Africa. I always like to tell people that if I stand on the beach here, the next landmass to the south of us is Antarctica, which of course has recently been very much in the news with regards to the discoveries they made with regards to the Thowitz Glacier, what they call the Doomsday Glacier. But anyway, that's where I am. And what we do as a business, I'm the founder of a company called Future Work IQ. And what we do is help leadership teams get their heads around what the future of work will look like, probably on about a 4 to 5 year timeline, and then to re-engineer their businesses based on that so that they can remain relevant. Now, one of the things that popped up on the horizon for us was obviously the climate crisis and what we are going to need to do as governments and as corporations and as individuals in order to mitigate and adapt to what is coming our way. We saw that as a major incident which people are going to have to pay attention to, and thus my interest in climate literacy and what we can do to decarbonize our businesses. But today is not about Joseph and I. Today is really about talking to Shawna. And Shawna, I really want to say to you, thank you very much for being prepared to pop in and have a conversation about a topic that I know you're passionate about. I've been following Shawna on LinkedIn, and we've had a couple of interactions on LinkedIn around this topic of decarbonizing events, and I've always found your comments very insightful, very balanced, in fact, and that's why I reached out and said, would you be willing to come and talk to us and share your experience and expertise in this field? So maybe you can, over to you, and just a little bit more about what you do and where you are based at the moment, etc. Thanks, Shawna.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk about a topic that I'm pretty geeky about, I guess I would say. I'm based in the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations in the city that's also known as Vancouver, Canada. And for the last 25 years or so, I've worked as an event sustainability consultant. So early on, that involved doing a lot of work to help event planners take basic steps to reduce waste around their event. The first large-scale event that I actually worked on was way back in 1994. It was the Commonwealth Games that were held here in Victoria. And I held an arts and culture festival in a very old and dilapidated hockey arena that didn't have any on-site catering services or staging or AV or even basic waste management at the venue. So we focused a lot of our time on creating what we now refer to as a zero waste program for the event. So we took steps to reduce food waste and recycle and compost, and actually had food donation done by the venue and the catering provider for the first time at that event. So it was a big deal back then, but it's not all that impressive to talk about now. I think that one of the good news stories about this topic is we have come a long way in terms of our ability to practice sustainable events. And rather than focusing so much on waste management these days, a lot of my work is involved with carbon measurement and management of events. So this question of decarbonisation of events is one that I contemplate on a daily basis. And my focus these days is more on business events, less on festivals. So a lot of my work projects are asking questions like, how do we reduce carbon emissions at things like association conferences, trade shows, incentive programs, business summits, and things like that? And how do we create environmental management systems for these events so that we can look at sort of the big picture as far as the environmental harm that can be caused and ways that we should be reducing that. So I still do a lot of field consulting. I also do a bit of teaching. So I teach and I mentor students who are just entering the field, and it's work that I really enjoy because I find students are super passionate about events, but they're also much more passionate and much more knowledgeable about sustainability, certainly, than when I started my own career. So it's a really good combination because they have so many more tools at their disposal now, from online event platforms to cleaner power systems and software tools that help them measure carbon impacts. So we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a long way to go, and that's what keeps me busy day to day.
Fantastic. All right, Shawna, thanks. Listen, I just want to start asking you a little bit about some of the vocabulary that we were using in our preparatory conversations for today, just so that we're all on the same, so that we know we're using the same vocabulary, that we're using the same set of assumptions. So you talked about the fact that events are spending an unfair share of our remaining carbon budget. Would you just be able to clarify what you mean by those terms, just so that we're all speaking from the same page?
Sure. So in my line of work, one of the things that I often do for events is I audit carbon footprint fingerprints. So I learn about what are the major sources of emissions, how much emissions are being generated by different event types. And because I do analysis for different types of events, one of the things that I've learned is that every event's footprint is quite unique. But also, if we look at event types, we find that there's similar sources of emissions and total amounts of emissions. So, for example, I said earlier that I focus in on international business meetings. And what a carbon footprint analysis for most business meetings will tell me is that the typical carbon footprint of an event participant is between 1 to 3 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per person. And most of that impact comes from transportation, although it also comes from other things like venue energy, food footprints, waste, and things like that. So what's striking to me about that, if we look at the mid to high end of that range, so 2 to 3 tons of emissions generated per participant, that actually exceeds the per capita annual carbon footprint of people living in Pacific Island nations like Samoa or Tonga or Fiji, all of which are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And if we take it a little farther, analysts have suggested that in order to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, lifestyle carbon footprints should fall to less than 3 tons per person per year globally by 2030. And some events, the carbon footprint of those events can exceed that in just a few days per person. So when I talk about the carbon footprint of events sometimes using an unfair share of the carbon budget, that's what I'm referring to. And does that mean that all events are using an unfair share? No. obviously not. I can tell you that local events, ones that have a high level of online engagement or may use hybrid formats, or where people are able to travel by train or cleaner forms of transportation, those can be quite low impact and very fair. But there are also some events that are emitting a lot more than seems reasonable when we're facing a limited carbon budget.
So I guess there's like an intuitive or a knee-jerk response here that maybe we should just stop doing these events, right? Because it's a bit different to asking other people to stop like consuming energy at home, right? Because if you say stop using energy at home, people are going to go, well, I'm going to be cold or I won't be able to cook. But it seems a little bit more reasonable to say stop going to these international business events because presumably they could find another way of doing things. Should we just say people stop, or are there other middle ways?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There are certain types of events that I know we'd really hate to lose. Arts and cultural events are a joy to experience. But in the case of business events, I think that what we have to be mindful of is there are very good reasons to have them. We can look at certain events, some of the ones that we study in class with students. We look at events that have gone on to create really important legacies that we benefit from. One of the events we talk about that took place here in Vancouver in the 1990s was the International AIDS Conference. And that's where researchers presented a lot of their findings that started to talk about the effectiveness of antiretroviral therapies that, went on to help HIV infection become a manageable disease. So, those are really important impacts. We have an event in Canada that we call Orange Shirt Day, and it's really helped to further a conversation around truth and reconciliation and the Indigenous residential school system that is really starting a national dialogue that's important to have. So there are very good reasons to have events, and this idea of sort of canceling events, that's certainly too broad. It's way too hasty. I think what we have to advocate for is mindfulness about what the purpose of events is, and constantly asking ourselves, what's the impact of the event before, during, and after? Does the outcome merit the carbon cost? And if the outcome is worthwhile, we really have to work hard to make sure that it's achieved at the least carbon cost possible. So I think it's just really about mindfulness. It's about cultivating purpose with events and making sure that they're worthwhile and they're not a waste of that scarce carbon budget.
I guess that's a pretty subjective thing, though, isn't it? I mean, who decides what is worthwhile? Presumably, some huge corporate is going to have a different idea about what's worthwhile than an activist from the Suquamish people.
Oh, absolutely. So I think that's why, first of all, the audience matters. So the audience and how they feel about events and the expectations that they have around the diversity of outcomes and the cost that's involved in that event become really important. There is a standard in the sustainable event world called ISO 20121. It's the ISO standard for sustainability management in events. And a fundamental part of that standard, which is really sort of the gold standard for ensuring that events are managed in a mindful way, it calls on us to take into account the feedback of stakeholders on the critical environmental issues that we face. And we find that more and more events are turning toward that standard as a way to ensure that they're doing due diligence about different stakeholder needs. So it's not necessarily just about thinking about what the business feels about that event and driving an outcome that may not have decarbonisation or sustainability at its heart, but it's thinking about how does the public perceive that generally? How do my customers perceive that generally? How do the members of my association perceive what we're doing or not doing in a general way to make sure that the management practices for that event are becoming more aligned with the future world that we want to create. Because to your point, it is absolutely very subjective.
Shawna, I want to ask you a question about event organisers in a second. But before we do that, I just want to mention to everybody who's listening to us today, maybe what you can do is use the reaction tool at the bottom. If this is your first LinkedIn live audio experience, so if you could just use the little reaction button there. It is for you, Nora. Okay. I don't know how many of you have actually attended these. But here's what's so exciting about this medium of conversation is that this is meant to be a co-created experience. In other words, what it's not for you as listeners to necessarily just sit back and take in the information. If you have a question that comes up as a result of what we're talking about here, please just raise your hand, and what I will do is get you up onto stage, and you can ask your question or make your observation. It is something actually that we want you to be involved with quite a bit. That will be exciting. Under no pressure, of course, to do so. It is something that you can just willingly participate in. But we would love to hear your comments and observations as we go through this conversation. Social audio.
I think it's worth noting as well. So could I just jump in there, Peter?
Yeah.
Is that I know that it can feel a bit weird down there in the audience to muscle in and a bit intimidating, but I strongly encourage you to take the opportunity to find your voice and be part of these climate conversations. Because one of the things I notice when I speak to people is that I speak to people that got all sorts of interesting things to say when you speak one-on-one, but they don't necessarily engage in these more public conversations. And consequently, if they're looking to make a presence for themselves in the climate scene, that they go undiscovered. So I think these are really nice opportunities just to get more comfortable with finding a voice and getting involved in the climate conversation, so you can have the voice that you deserve in these discussions. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
No, that's 100%. And I just want to mention to you that Shawna is here. She's dedicated a bit of time to us. So if there are questions that you need to redirect to her and ask her, then this is really the opportunity to do so. So Shawna, getting back to what I mentioned earlier about event organisers, I know you sometimes speak about there being blind spots for event organisers that they need to be aware of. Could you perhaps just elaborate a little bit on that? What are you referring to when you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think, for everyday events, a lot of common blind spots that can lead to vulnerabilities around greenwashing. We use a lot of buzzwords, talk about jargon that we mentioned earlier. I look at my LinkedIn stream these days and I hear events referred to as being sustainable and regenerative and carbon neutral and carbon positive and net zero. And it's enough to sort of make the head spin around what do all these things mean and which claims are credible. And I think that that's a big blind spot for events organisers, is making a claim about a practice or an attribute of your event without fully understanding the details that would make that claim credible. So, we see a lot of events right now focusing on the use of carbon offsets, and sometimes very low quality carbon offsets, to make claims around carbon neutrality or carbon positivity or net zero, rather than pursuing substantial direct emissions reduction. And, folks who move in this space know that that's against guidance that's provided by different initiatives like the Race to Zero or the High Level Expert Group on Net Zero claims. So making that type of a claim, if you don't know what you're talking about, leaves the host open to criticism. And that can happen intentionally. More often than not, it happens unintentionally, because event teams don't often have specialists on those teams that know the ins and outs of the claims and have that technical knowledge. So in terms of talking about transferring into sustainable job opportunities and green job opportunities, the employment opportunities in events right now are significant. And what really sets candidates apart, I find, is if they can come into those positions with pre-existing expertise in these topics, because it's a skill that we don't often see embedded in a person who's coming out with training in event management necessarily. So that's, I think, a really important opportunity for event organizers to close a blind spot, is hiring people who have that expertise and want to be the person on the team who cultivates that expertise within an event agency or within an event organization. And that helps to, I think, protect from some of these blind spots. Another blind spot, I think, is focusing too much on the small stuff. Like, for many years now, we've been eliminating paper and doing away with single-use disposable plastic water bottles. And don't get me wrong, that's really helpful. But if we only talk about that and we don't acknowledge some of these larger impacts that we need to manage, like transportation, for example, that can really backfire and lead to criticism. So yeah, there's lots of blind spots, and investing in that internal expertise is certainly a way to better inoculate against it.
You know, this reminds me of something. If I'm not mistaken, Shawna, you joined a conversation that I had with Leo, a friend of mine that I met at the Leiden University. When we were talking about a paper that they produced where they compared the carbon footprint of a large astronomy meeting in 2019 and then what happened during COVID when that entire meeting went online, and the astronomical amount of carbon emissions that were saved as a result of going from an in-person to a virtual meeting. I think if I'm not mistaken, the paper highlighted that it was by a magnitude of like 3,000 times less intensive to have the meeting online. Do you recall that conversation?
I absolutely do.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So what I wanted to ask you just about that is, the experience that we had with COVID obviously taught us. We were forced to actually do things differently, which may not have happened had we not had the pandemic experience. But would you not say that this is another blind spot in the sense that now that we have had these lessons that we've learned to now just want to go back to the way things were before? What's your view on that?
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to. I remember that conversation very well. And one of the things, if there's a silver lining to the pandemic at all within the event sector, is that it forced us to really innovate in online event and hybrid event formats to keep people connected when they couldn't be physically connected. And I feel that, it's shifted audiences' expectations about how they want to engage in events. So I think, prior to 2019, let's say if you were a member of an association and you went to an annual convention for that association, you might sort of resign yourself to the fact there's no other way to go than to be there in person, or I'm just not going to have a great experience. But now I think the audience is much more savvy. In 2023, we expect things to be different. And what's interesting to me is if you listen within the event space, and if you listen outside of the event space, and when I say event space, I mean people who are involved in the industry and the community that puts on events. And then outside of the event space would be sort of the audience that isn't necessarily involved with what goes on behind the dark curtain, but attends and enjoys these experiences. You find a different you find that the struggle to change on the event sector side is much harder because there's older entrenched ways of doing business that we know work, that now our audience is sort of asking us to come forward and take the best of what we learned in the pandemic. And I think this is a part of what Leo and his group was doing, was try to show, we want to do events in a different way because of these different values that they have. And can you please come along with us to design experiences with that in mind, so that they're more centered on sort of custom experiences that allow attendees to engage on their own terms. And if anyone is interested in that study and the proliferation of research that's been done during the pandemic on the carbon impact of different event formats, there's essentially a whole list of resources that I can send you. I don't yet have them online. I have them in an offline format, so people are welcome to connect, and I can share that with you. But it's the ground has sort of shifted underneath us a bit, and attendees and customers that attend these events, I think, have different expectations. And climate is one of the things driving it.
So maybe that leads to the next question, which is, I know you also speak about purpose-driven events. So talk a little bit about that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think it kind of, I'm not sure about the both of you, but when I look at an event invitation these days, I find I'm asking myself a lot more, is it worth it, than I did before the pandemic, just because of all the considerations involved, the cost and the travel hassle and the time away from home and the health risk and, of course, the carbon. So I think that many people are thinking that way, and it causes them to become discerning about how they engage and if they engage. So event organizers really need to understand that people have become more purposeful in those choices, and they need to respond in turn. So what does that look like? Well, I think it means, on the one hand, that we're designing events differently based on the outcomes that participants want. So that kind of touches on what I just said. They know different is possible, and they expect us to be able to provide that. So one aspect of purposeful events is better matching the attendee purpose to a suitable event format. We know that some people do need to travel and connect with people in person in order to perform a job function, like outreach, like building relationships, like collaboration for the purposes of research and things like that. But we also know that a lot of information sharing and education can easily be delivered online. So just being more purposeful in how the format matches the attendee purpose and the outcome they're looking for is one way to answer that question. The other thing to keep in mind is that the organizations that allocate the budget for events, they're becoming more purposeful in how they allocate those budgets. And I think what that means is that events no longer have to achieve traditional goals that they had before the pandemic, but they have to do it in a way that aligns with sustainability. And that means event organizers are being pressured to maximize value. So if they're working within a company, for example, they no longer have to host an employee gathering once a year, but they have to make sure that that's done in a way that doesn't compromise perhaps goals around reducing emissions from business travel. If someone within that organization is planning something like an incentive trip, so let's say that the company once a year rewarded its high-performing sales executives with a trip off to a far-flung destination, that no longer aligns with the purposes and intentions around the company's sustainability goals. So the format of that event has to change. People need to be rewarded in a different way that may involve travel closer to home or things that don't even involve travel. So I think purpose-driven events to me is really about striving for that alignment, looking at the audience goals, layering in sustainability commitments the organization has, and making sure that events rise to enable those things.
Shawna, you're mentioning this. You're mentioning this idea, Shawna, of the values and the purpose of the attendees, right? To what degree do you think the attendees actually have a substantial ability to impact the decisions of the people who are running events? Is there an onus of responsibility on the attendees to articulate what they want, or should we really just be expecting the host to be driving these changes?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I feel strongly that event attendees have a really critical role to play. We are the customer, we're the employee, we're the fan, we're the member of organizations that, who host these events. So we literally hold the tickets, and we have the power to set the terms for engaging in those events. And I know this because I sit in on planning meetings for event teams where, I have to say, event organizers bring forward a lot of really innovative ideas to cut carbon footprints. And they want to do these things. And what inevitably happens is sometime during that meeting, someone says, well, will attendees really want us to do that? Will they like it? Will they complain? And often the idea dies on the table because there's a nervousness about whether or not the attendee will be receptive. And I think that what I try to keep in mind in those situations is, things like in 1999, we thought attendees wouldn't like paperless events, but now we can't imagine going to an event without, the mobile app or the ticket in our pocket, because we don't want to have to hold all that paper that we used to hold at these events and all that, exhibit collateral. 2005, we thought, well, we don't really want to give up single-use disposable water bottles, but today's stadiums, concert halls, they're figuring out seamless refill services. And we can look at it, many examples like that, where someone took the initial brave step to sort of nudge and, test attendees. Would you be willing for us to eliminate meat at our events and go more plant-based? Would you be willing to take us up on our online and hybrid offering? So I think that there's nervousness on the part of event organizers about how these types of steps will be received, and attendees can help a lot. So if we think about, how many of us have let a post-event evaluation kind of languish in our email inbox, that's really a great opportunity to speak up for the changes that you'd like to see, and also express I think, support and affirmation for when we see events getting it right. Because I also have to say on the flip side that we don't often hear from attendees about when we're getting it right, to know that they're supportive, and sometimes that can lead to some steps being clawed back as well. So attendees and what you say absolutely matters, I feel.
So I see Sylvie's here, but just one, and I won't take you too much longer, one tiny little follow-up question. Do we actually know, because everything that you're talking about at the moment kind of sounds just like, or people are a little bit nervous and not too sure. Have we got any evidence yet about whether or not attendees really care about this, or is it a really work in progress? We're just trying to figure it out.
Well, I think there's select research. So some of those papers I indicated earlier will show that they're asking, some of the organizations that are doing this research are asking their attendees for direct feedback on changes in event formats or in event menus or various steps that are taken to decarbonize, in order to be able to gauge, is this landing with our stakeholder groups in the right way? Are they accepting? So, certainly there's results we can speak to there. There are a number of associations. I can't yet share it because it hasn't been published yet, that are doing research around attendee requests for changes in practice. So one example, actually, the Organization for Human Brain Mapping recently released a paper about a steering committee that probed their attendees about support for decarbonization of event efforts. Would they attend different event formats? How supportive would they be, in order to assess the level of support? So, sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but there are pockets of examples, Joseph. And I can share that information and links following the event if people want to connect.
Thanks, Shawna. Sylvie, welcome, and you can unmute and ask your question or observation.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for organizing this event. I've been working in IT for 20 plus years, and I'm trying to do a career shift and find a new position to help fight climate change. So I'm really interested by the discussion today. The question I wanted to ask to Shawna is, I love the idea of, how can we do things differently, and how can we be more mindful to align to what people are expecting to see an event, what they're trying to get from an event, and also how do we want to do things differently to be more environmental friendly. Do you think also there is a need, and maybe there are, because I'm really novice into all these, but do you think there needs to be more policies for maybe companies that are not changing the way they do things to be more environmental friendly? How can we make sure that people are shifting and taking all these changes into consideration?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And Sylvie, bless you for finding the climate role in your job. I think there's many people like you in our sector that are really trying to align their values with the work that they do. So I'm glad you're here. I think that if I understand the question correctly, I think my response to that is, it's sort of about, will we eventually be regulated? Do we need regulation to get us there? And my feeling is, I think that is what will ultimately tip the scales in terms of making this more of a mainstream practice. And I don't think that that's going to take necessarily directly regulating the event industry. I think the way that we will feel it is through the regulation of other sectors that we rely on. So we've already felt it around regulations on things like banning plastic at event venues and requirements to curtail food waste and things like that. And I think what we'll start to see is the impact of regulation that's happening more in the transportation space. So, I think if we look at what's happening, limits on aviation, increased cost of aviation is going to require, I think, changes in the scale of events and the nature of events, and more adaptation to online content, hybrid content, to supplement perhaps smaller scale in-person regional experiences. So I think necessary part of the equation. And what we have now is this window to adapt to that, because I think there's still probably a few years before that's going to happen. And if we're not able to adapt, my fear is that for the events sector, it will become sort of our next COVID moment, where we're sort of caught off guard by something and haven't taken advantage of the time we have now, because regulation will be a key component, I think. Does that answer your question, Sylvie?
Yes, thank you so much.
Sylvie, I just want to make another comment about your thinking of transitioning. So I just want to add to what Shawna said here. You know, when I say we, I mean at Future Work IQ, we kind of look down the road, and we look at what will happen in the not too distant future, and what will be the response of governments and others to the events that unfold as the climate crisis worsens. One of the things that's going to have to happen is the experience that we have of having virtual events. And when I say virtual, I mean either online events like the one we're having now, which is just a conversation we're having around this topic, or actually even further than that, where it actually goes into, you know, what they call the metaverse, and it's not Facebook related, but you know, virtual reality and all that kind of stuff. So I'm thinking that, you know, that experience of people having a very similar experience to what they would have in person is going to have to be created, because as Shawna correctly said, and I believe this too, that at some point, you know, flying around and driving with petrol driven vehicles and being in buildings that aren't using clean energy will just not become possible. And then the question will be, well, you know, how do we do things now? And the point that Shawna made was absolutely that what's going to happen, it's going to catch many people off guard, which is quite frightening. But it also means that there's an opportunity to create or get involved in work that relates to this space. And just one final comment, and then you know, I'll pass on to Joe. I wanted to just say to you, Sylvie, you know, there was an organization called, I'm just trying to think of what these guys were now. But they started like an online events portal just before COVID. And because of the COVID experience, what happened is that business completely exploded as people were trying to find the tools and the technology to enable them to do events online. So I see a very similar thing happening again. You know, I think the COVID situation was like a good indication. Of course, COVID goes away like it has now. Now everybody wants to go back to business as usual, but the climate crisis is not going to function that way. It's just going to progressively get worse, in which case this scenario will remain there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I see. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what I see around me is that COVID somehow served at least people to realize that they can do things from home and not traveling that much. I know in the company I used to work for, there was lots of teams who wanted absolutely to have their team member on site, and you know, they realized that things were working fine. So I think, to your point, we will be able to do a lot of things remotely. I'm really interested into, you know, rethinking the way we used to do things so that it's more environmental friendly, but by starting with the customer needs and understanding what they're expecting at an event, what the company is expecting when they organize an event, and really completely rethink that with the new tool we have now to do things virtually, remotely. So yeah, I do believe that for me, we won't be able to achieve those goals if we don't completely rethink the way we used to do things before.
I absolutely agree with you. Nora, you've popped on. Could you unmute?
Yes, hi everyone, and nice to meet everyone, and thank you so much for this event, I learned so much. I had, for example, no idea that there was an ISO standard for sustainable events. So there's a very steep learning curve here for me. So I work as a stakeholder engagement specialist with a lot of audiences such as policymakers, researchers, civil society. And during the pandemic, almost all of this work is now happening in interactive digital events. And I think in some of these cases, it's going to stay this way because it's very multinational teams. But I'm also hearing a lot about hybrid events these days. And so my question would be, especially to Shawna, whether you have any good idea or any good experiences with hybrid events, or whether it's more of a fad that doesn't really work because there's always maybe going to be this difference between the people who connect digitally and the people who are there face to face.
Oh, it's like the eternal question. If I only had the perfect answer to that. It's such a good one, Nora. So I feel strongly that the approach that we have to hybrid events is sometimes done in a way that disadvantages one format over the other. So we have a hybrid event because it's really about sort of people engaging in a limited way because they can't make it to the main event that is happening in person. And that's sort of where the action happens, where everyone would prefer to be. And the hybrid is sort of a portal to that. I think that sort of lack of equity in the two formats is the thing that we're wrestling with right now to figure out what works best for each organization. And, one example that people are suggesting is a more viable and equitable format is where we look at sort of a hub and spoke models, where there are in-person regional smaller scale events that are connected to each other in a hybrid way at different times or select parts on the agenda. So the content and engagement happening at those hubs is equal across those hubs. And then there's this sort of connection and integration that happens online. But I think that's something, each organization is sort of feeling its way in what's going to work best for them and kind of having to learn through experimentation. And I think that's the challenge for each individual org. But I think we're making progress. And I think the hard thing is getting an organization to stick with it and sort of approach it as an experiment that, we're going to tweak and learn from over time in order to make sure it maximizes involvement from everyone in an equitable way and reduces that carbon impact. So it's imperfect, but I hope it's getting better, Nora.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm glad that I'm not the only one who is taking a let's try things out and see approach on this. Because, from the sides of organizations, I feel that there's a lot of perfectionism involved and this expectation that these models should have been figured out at this point. So it's great to know that I'm not the only one who is still experimenting with these things.
Yeah, when you get it figured out, I look forward to your LinkedIn Live event with Peter and Joseph.
Oh, I'll definitely
talk about it then.
I wonder if there aren't some answers to be had here from the educational community, because I remember during COVID, when I was still teaching, I was doing this kind of hybrid teaching where I'd have half the class in the room and half the class at home on Teams, and dealing with it just as one teacher in a room. How do you deliver these two very different experiences to people at the same time? And I know that there was a lot of educational research kind of like being done on the fly within the university community. So it could be that there's some kind of best practice kind of in the silo of higher education that could be mapped over onto events. I'm not sure, just kind of thinking out loud.
I expect there is. I expect the association sector probably has some examples as well, because it sort of gets back at that the purposes of the different audiences too. I think it's tough in a classroom environment where there's maybe equal expectations from the group in the room together and the group on Teams that they want to have the same types of discussions and interactions. But one of the ways in which hybrid events can be successful in association events show this, as do some corporate events, is where people have that purpose of education and content sharing, streaming those attendees, sort of funneling them towards the online environment, and those that are there for other purposes that require more collaboration, more discussions there at the in-person event. So yeah, education would be one place, association events would be another, and I think I've seen some corporations do that quite successfully for their employee conferences as well.
Nora, your question and Joe's comment now leads me to ask you another question, Shawna. In your experience from the sort of community, the business community that you're working in at the moment, are you seeing that instead of flying speakers from other venues and other cities into a place, that those people are now appearing virtually to speak, or are you seeing that we've gone back to business as normal?
I'll jump in first, I guess. For me, I still see more of it than I think is ideal. More of the flying in person for speaking and for panel presentations than I think is certainly what I would hope we'd be at in this post-pandemic period. There's pockets of examples, and I actually hear of pockets of examples of speakers pushing back on invitations to attend in person to speak and sort of steering event organizers to, I'd love to be able to be in front of your audience, but I'm not willing to fly. Do you have options for me to come in and speak virtually? And sometimes that is met with, yes, we can do that. And sometimes it's like, no, that's not the event that we're looking to plan, and we'll look for a speaker who is willing to come in person. But I'd say we're still having lots of people fly in to do that, in my experience. I don't know what Nora and Sylvie see, but
so Shawna, I'm glad you mentioned this, because I obviously speak and I get invited to speak, but I have just refused to fly to speak. So if an organization or an event wants me to speak at an event, I have to be on screen, and I've done 3 of these. And it's a very interesting experience, because you have to tailor your entire presentation to now incorporate an audience that is sitting in a room, and you that are able to see that audience, they can see you on the screen. And what I found really works is being able to use like polling software and all that kind of stuff that you can have, where you can actually get the audience to become involved in the event, as opposed to just leaning back and watching some guy on a TV screen talking. That's just been my experience. But you're quite right that many events, I had one just recently that said exactly what you just said. Sorry, if you're not prepared to come here, then that takes care of that thought.
I just wanted to take a couple of moments, if I could, just to explore this, encouraging people to do this from a different angle. We've been spending our time talking about the decarbonisation, and obviously that's the subject of our conversation. But one of the things that has, I think, been, again, tying back into COVID, what has been just such a golden opportunity for so many people are all of the people who don't have the financial resources or the time or the flexibility to get to events, who, because of COVID, could suddenly attend these live events online. And I wonder, do we need to complement our framing of this issue, not just about decarbonisation, but a kind of a social equity thing, where if you want to do right by people, give people an opportunity. If we're going to live in a meritocracy, we need to be able to open up access to these events to different people. Are there different ways, do you think, Shawna, that we need to frame the conversation that is more expansive than just carbon?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you raised that question, because one of the things, again, referring back to the research that's come out on what the impact of the shift online has been during the pandemic, one of the things or themes that a lot of that research has focused on is have our events become more accessible to people who have been at the margins of those organizations. And inevitably, what most of that research suggests is that women, people from countries where visas present significant barriers to travel, or economics present barriers to being able to afford to travel, caregivers that are tied to their home for, caring for loved ones, they've been at the margins of events all the way up until the pandemic, and suddenly they're seen, and they're able to participate and engage now that we have these formats to be able to enable that. So the research actually gives a bit of quantifiable data on that dimension of the conversation, Joseph. So there is a lot of evidence to that. The only sort of footnote I'll add, or caveat I'll add, is that we need to be careful about making an assumption that everyone finds a virtual and online event accessible, because there are issues with how it's presented and captioning that really make it a good reason to hire a professional when doing that, because it's important to ensure that the technology enables that equal experience, and that those on the other end of the event, the remote end of the event, are actually able to access the infrastructure that allow them to connect online. So it's I think the gains are greater. We've made a lot of headway, so that it's a net gain, but we still have to be mindful there's work for us to do to make that format accessible. I just wanted to say, Nora, did you have a comment? Because I think I saw you unmute, but go back on mute.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes, oh my God, I could talk about these things 1,000 hours, but just connecting to what you just said, in terms of accessibility, what I mentioned is that I have a lot of friends who are in the immunocompromised and high-risk community, which means that with the pandemic, the way it's still ongoing, they are effectively, some of them are completely shut out of public life when it is face-to-face, because the risk to their health is just too great. So in that regard, I think it's also really important acknowledging that online events are, at this point, the only events truly accessible and safe for them. Unless you have really amazing COVID-safe events where everything is like super up to scratch, I guess that would be the exception where they could attend. So that's one addition to that. And in terms of accessibility and the thing that you, Shawna, just mentioned on not everyone liking the online format as a way of learning and getting information. One thing that I found with working with very different audiences is that sometimes we take basic technical skills for granted that some people, especially during the pandemic time, who attend online events do not have. Like sometimes even a copy and paste is too much to ask, because some people still don't have these very basic technical skills. And that was for me a learning moment when I realized these things. But I think we really underestimate that in general.
Thanks, Nora. So you're quite right. I mean, if things are going to happen digitally, digital literacy and fluency become a very, very important subject. And I'm assuming that if events had to happen more online more regularly, there would have to be almost like an onboarding for a virtual attendee, if you know what I mean. Sylvie, any comment from you, and anybody else that's also listening to us? So I see Nuala has joined us, and Christina's been here for a while, and Paula, if there's anything you would like to add to the conversation, please pop up and have a chat to us. Sylvie?
Yeah, and so in my previous company, when we organize also lots of live events, especially for internal events, things were done online, and you also have the technical issue sometimes, so that it's impacting. I think, well, it's going to be something that's going to improve, but having the exact same experience when you're online as if you were in the room is quite difficult to replicate, right? It's not exactly really always have the feeling sometimes that you miss something. So I think having the tools to communicate with people, to continue to network with the audience as well, things that can help you to really have the same kind of experiences that you can have during the event. But as Nora was mentioning, then the tool needs to be easy for everyone, maybe explain ahead of time, and then, having the making sure that you won't have, or at least you have at least the list of technical issue.
Thank you, Sylvie. Paula, welcome up. You can unmute and
Thank you. I just want to comment on what Joseph's comment about during COVID, the events becoming more accessible to all people because they were online. And for me, it's been a game changer because there's so many wonderful conferences all around the world, and it's impossible to attend in person. And it's just been a total game changer. And I see more and more events that are offered online, like a hybrid event, annual conferences and things like that. So I hope that becomes part of best practices for all organizations.
Thank you, Paula.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me here, and I'd be interested to get maybe Shawna's behind the scenes perspective, is that my comments and Paula's as well are kind of coming from this, like the benefits to the attendees. You get access that you couldn't have before because of money, time, flexibility, whatever. But presumably there is also this benefit to the people who are doing the event, right? Or if you were an employer who were interviewing, by using these remote options, you've suddenly got a talent pool, for an example, or a customer pool, an attendee pool that you just never had before, which presumably expands your business opportunities significantly. But I don't know, do people see it that way, Shawna, at the other end, or do they kind of have some curious resistance? Maybe there's a lack of imagination, or maybe some other kind of agenda where they're kind of pushing back accessibility.
Yeah, I think two thoughts on that. I think there are people who have really understood, and I'm going to give the example of professional associations here, where during the pandemic, to Paula's point, I think there was suddenly this influx of people that had never been able to engage in an association event before because they couldn't or didn't, or for whatever reason, travel wasn't accessible to them. Now suddenly they're at the doorstep of an association where perhaps they weren't currently a member, but now they're seeing value because they can get that content and that education and networking online. And I think we see examples of associations responding to that, to realize that this is, a bigger, member attraction strategy, a member retention strategy to maintain these types of formats and continue to cultivate them. I think the other reality check we have to be mindful of, however, is it can take time to figure out then how we need to remonetize events. Because if we look at an annual conference, again, for an association, that is a significant revenue stream, typically for an association. So having to now rethink, how do we price registration for this fundamental change in format or multiple formats and new types of events in order to ensure the financial sustainability of our organization? That's a whole other challenge for an organization to wrestle with, particularly if some of those economic models for conferencing are quite entrenched with an in-person experience. That's not quite as easy as it might seem to do. Doesn't happen quickly.
Shawna, we said that we would only keep you an hour, and you've been very kind to share your insights with us. We've really enjoyed this conversation, and I just want to say to you, Sylvie, Nora, and Paula, thank you for joining in. This is a co-creation event, and your perspectives sent the conversation into an area which I think is really, really important that we could have gone, and I appreciate that very much, that you will be willing to come up here. We're going to be hosting these regularly, so you can join us again in future. But Shawna, maybe just on your part, just to close off our conversation, I just want to ask you your number one thing that you think we should be focusing on when it comes to events and their reduction of carbon, etc. What would that be, do you think?
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I want to echo everything you sent. It's been really nice to have the participation from the audience and the comments. So thank you for the invite. It's been lovely to be here. I think if you can indulge me too, because I'm going to take the participant perspective first. Transportation is the number one source of carbon emissions for most events. So anything that we can do as participants to address that elephant in the room really helps. Taking the train, whether it's opting for online, whether it's carpooling, whether anything we can do to reduce that impact is really important. From the organ planner perspective, though, one thing we haven't touched on, so maybe I'll just plant this seed going forward, is, I really feel that events are a powerful vehicle for having conversations and creating space and inspiration for the work that we need to do to address this crisis. And that a lot of those things happen best in small scale community events where we can get together and feel safe to have tough conversations with each other. And I just, rather than end it on a note of how challenging transportation is to deal with, because it is, I just really want to empower people to try and find that way that they can use their event as a vehicle, whatever the format is, for inspiration, for people to think about this topic and act on this topic and talk to people about this topic, because I think at the end of the day, those are the fundamental things that we need to do to decarbonize everything, and events can be a tool for that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Shawna. Appreciate your insights. Joseph, some parting comments from you?
Yeah, all good. I mean, listen, again, I just want to encourage people to come back next month. I think we're going to have Heather Burns talking next month. Heather is the founder of the Connecticut Sustainable Business Council and also ESG Consulting Biz, where she helps out people establish sustainability consultant careers. So just do come along. Have ideas, be prepared to share, and develop your voice as much as possible.
Great stuff. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Shawna and Paula, Sylvia, Nora, and everybody else that was listening to us. We appreciate your being here and spending this time with us. We'll see you next time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.